السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Just check. So people on Zoom, you can hear me? Just let me know. Yeah, thumbs up? Okay, good. So first of all, I want to apologize. I was a bit late, but for the people who are live, you guys very much enjoy your samosa. So today, inshallah, the topic is on the idea of the miracles of the Quran. And for those who were here last semester, this is part of a three-part series. So the first one we did was proofs of Allah's existence. Second one was proofs of the Prophet ﷺ, that he was a prophet. And today we're going to talk about the miracles of the Quran. Just by show of hands, did anybody come to the previous lectures? No? Oh, you came? Okay. One? Okay, yeah. So just to kind of to explain to you how this is going to work. So even in my previous lectures, the way I approached this topic was made it interdisciplinary. And so the idea was I didn't want to focus on just one aspect of the miracles of Islam. I wanted to touch upon it from multiple angles. I think there's some strong there's strength in approaching it like that because people have different inclinations and people get amazed through different ways. Some people get amazed through the experiential knowledge. Some people get amazed through science. Some people get amazed through history, etc., etc. So there's some strength in using an interdisciplinary approach. There's some weaknesses too. Amongst the weaknesses is, like, since I'm presenting you guys all these different arenas by which you could look at the miracles of Islam, I'm definitely not an expert in all these different things, right? So I'm just kind of sharing with you guys what other experts have said, right? That's one thing. Second, since we're looking at human endeavors, right? So whether it's science or history, those particular things are based on human research, which can change as time progresses. But we look at what's current and then we compare it to what we find in Islam, and then we see if there's any things that might amaze us about those particular findings. So today we're going to look at the miracle of the Quran, and the way I'm going to do it is we're going to look at 5 different facets. Mostly 4. The last one we'll just touch on it very briefly. So we're going to be looking at the preservation of the Quran, scientific miracles, which is a very common, popular kind of field that's developed over the years, literary miracles, historical miracles, and then the experiential miracle. And again, like for those who attended the previous sessions, if you attended the other 2, they all kind of complement each other. So if you just attended this session, inshallah, it will be of benefit. It's a standalone, but really when you put them all together, then it's more powerful, I believe. So we'll start off with the idea of the preservation of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has guaranteed that he will preserve the Quran. Now, for Muslims, they kind of take this for granted, right? That this is just something, it's a given. But for anybody who's kind of studied the history of religious traditions from other religious faiths, and you study the history of religious scriptures, you'll find that this claim is a quite amazing claim. Because you'll find throughout, you look at the major world religious traditions, for historians of religions, and people who are scholars of those particular faiths, they'll admit that there's been alterations, there's been changes. This is something that's well known among scholars of whatever religious tradition you find in terms of the major world religious traditions. Now, I'll give you an example of this. And I'm giving the example of the Bible, but not to attack it or anything. It's just because I'm more familiar with it than other religious traditions, but this can apply to other religious traditions as well. So this right here, any idea what this is? Yeah. Exactly. The earliest manuscript of the Bible, and I believe the New Testament, if I'm correct. So this right here, as you can see, it's very small. It's the size of like a card, right? So this is the earliest manuscript, and it's dated from 125 to 200 CE, right? So about 125 to 200 years after Jesus, right? And that's all that survives in terms of that early manuscript. The earliest complete manuscripts are dated from the 4th century CE, so about 300 years after Jesus. Also, when you look into the New Testament, it's written in Greek. Now, here's a question for you guys. Jesus, did he speak Greek? Aramaic, right? Which you will find there is some Aramaic in the New Testament, but not a lot, right? Very little, just 1 or 2 lines. It's mostly in Greek, and Jesus did not speak Greek. And then again, when you kind of look into the different manuscripts and you kind of compare them, there's a lot of differences that are not reconcilable. And one kind of professor who's very popular who writes about this, he was a practicing Christian and he became agnostic, and he's written a lot on it. And he's like popular. There's others, but it's Bart Ehrman. Have you guys heard of him? So he's very popular in kind of writing about this type of stuff. And what makes him, like, there are other people who are maybe even more scholarly than him, but what makes him popular is he takes very academic discussions and he makes it accessible to mass audiences. So I remember when I was in my undergrad, I read quite a bit of his stuff. And this idea of, that there's discrepancies between the manuscripts is not something that modern Western academics have come up with to attack Christianity. This is something that is attested to within the tradition of Christian scholarship. So, for example, Origen, who was one of the early Christian scholars of the 3rd century CE, he noted that there was discrepancies between the manuscripts because the copyists were making mistakes, they were adding stuff, they're deleting, etc. So this is something that is attested to very early on. Now, within the Quranic kind of history of manuscripts, a few years back, there was a manuscript found of the Quran, which was carbon dated from 568 CE to 645 CE, which is quite amazing because this is basically the time the Muslims date, the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So it's dating to his life. It's interesting, this was found in Birmingham, which is, how did it end up in Birmingham? When the British and the French, they came and they colonized lands, they stole a bunch of stuff with them. So somehow, it was in Birmingham. So this is something, and it's not a full manuscript, it's a partial manuscript. It has parts of Surah Kaf, Taha, and what's the one before that? Maryam, yeah. So this is kind of the earliest manuscript that we're aware of. But in Turkey and in Uzbekistan, in the Topkapi Palace, if anybody's been there, very beautiful palace which has museums. They have complete manuscripts of the Quran, which they say date back to the time of Uthman anhu, so shortly after Prophet. Although there are people from Western academics and others who dispute whether these go back. Allah knows best. The thing I want to mention here, though, about this, because I'm talking about manuscripts, to be honest with you, when I found out about the Birmingham manuscript, it was a big deal. I personally didn't really care. I'll tell you why. If there was no manuscripts of the Quran, would that affect the way the Quran is preserved?
No.
Why?
It's oral tradition, mutawatir.
Oral tradition. Exactly.
All the recitations are mass transmitted. So.
And you don't really have this in other these traditions. You don't have like a hafiz of the Bible or the hafiz of the Bhagavad Gita. You might have maybe some random, very practicing person, maybe, I don't know. But the thing is, it's not in the original language anyway, so I don't know what they're memorizing. They're memorizing basically translations. But in Islam, we have this idea of Hifzul Quran, which is a miracle. We take it for granted as Muslims, but it is a miracle. The fact that you can take somebody from 7th century Arabia, you could take somebody from 9th century Baghdad, you could take somebody from 12th century Mali, you could take somebody from 19th century, Indonesia, or the Ottoman Empire, etc. Take somebody from here. Maybe 90% are not even Arabs. Some of them might not even be literate. And they can confirm with each other the recitation of the Quran orally. That's a miracle. It really is a miracle. You won't find this in any tradition. I can guarantee, like, again, you might find some random, maybe, priest in some other religious tradition who's memorized their scripture, maybe. But the way how it's accessible to Muslims from everywhere, Islam doesn't have this idea that the Quran is just for this priestly class and everybody else just. And again, if you study, interesting enough, the history of the Bible in Western Europe, when it was decided to translate it and make it more accessible in German and all these things and mass print it, it caused a lot of issues because there was people within the Western Europe who didn't want the Bible to be accessible to the masses. And this wasn't the case for the Quran. So I really think this is a very powerful miracle of the Quran that we as Muslims, for those who are Muslim, we just take it for granted. But if you just step back and you compare it to other religious scriptures, it's quite amazing. It's quite amazing. So that's the first aspect. The second is I want to talk about the scientific miracles of the Quran. And I think that's probably one of the most popular kind of sub-branches of when you talk about the miracles of the Quran. It got popular over, I would say, the past few decades, maybe past century. And part of the reason why it became popular in the past century, more than maybe others, was because of the rise of science as a field of knowledge. Although science was there in previous times, but the value given to scientific knowledge in terms of it being a yardstick by which we can evaluate truth is something that's much more kind of modern. And even it has its problems in terms of we benefit from science in terms of advances of technology, but modern people often don't understand the limitations of science. And that's why you have so many people who study science, but when people study the philosophy of science, then you understand the limitations of science, all right? Which is something that when you understand it, you understand that science has its limits. And that's why, can a scientific theory contradict the Quran? It can. Of course it can, because it's a human endeavor. And you can make a mistake, the scientist can make a mistake. Science changes, right? And this is something that's known for historians of science and philosophers of science. In fact, there's interesting, you have this idea of false paradigms, where you could have so much research in science, where you're coming up with, developing technology and all these things, which is based on a false premise. And that research might be successful, but then only later on, after several findings, does that premise collapse, and then a new paradigm comes. And one of the most revolutionary books on this topic was Thomas Kuhn, who talked about the idea of scientific revolutions, where he talked about how science switches in terms of paradigms. The reason I'm mentioning this is the idea is scientific theories can potentially contradict the Quran. Now, a fact, though, something that is indisputable fact, of course, that won't. And the Quran itself beautifully tells insan to go reflect upon creation, right? And Muslims, at our kind of, at one point they call the golden era of Islam, which historians called, Muslims were the most advanced in science, right? But I'm just putting that premise there, that there are limitations in science. It's an amazing tool, but it is something that changes, right? And so what I'm going to be mentioning is some of the common kind of things that we've connected with modern scientific observations and eyes of the Quran that seem to be in sync, The most common, I'll just go into them quickly. One is the description of the development of the human being inside the mother's womb. Right? The Quran goes into quite detail of how the human being is developed inside, right? Between the alaqa and the nutfa and then the mudgha, idama, etc. There was one scientist who was really famous, and he popularized this idea of the science in the Quran, in particular, one of his findings, and he became Muslim. He wasn't Muslim before. Maurice Bucaille. Have you guys heard of him? Maurice Bucaille. He was a French researcher, and he was amazed at the way the Quran described the human development, the embryo, etc., and he became Muslim. And he wrote a book which is very popular about the scientific miracles of the Quran. And in particular, the idea of the alaqa. So the Quran refers to how at one stage in our development we're an alaq. And alaq is like a leech-like creature which appears only for a very short period of time, perhaps 4 or 5 days. And now how can somebody have known this at that time? And that's just one snippet, right? But when you go through the whole description of the Quran, which I don't have time to do, you could go read it, you'll see that it's so much detail that it seems unfathomable somebody 1,400 years ago could have observed all those facts, right? So this is one of the miracles of the Quran, and one of the popular ones that people discuss. And interesting enough, the first revelation of the Quran, the first verses were what? Iqra, right? And within the first verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what does he say? He created insan from alaq. And here there's a push for human beings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying he created you from alaq. So there's a push from human beings to understand what does alaq mean. And then when you look at its linguistic meanings, then you have to verify through observable data. So there was a push from the very beginning of the Quran to go basically study science, observe nature, verify it. And that's why, what do we call verses of the Quran? Ayat. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also refers to the universe as ayat. There are signs with ayat or signs within the book which connect to the signs in the universe, right? And for those who were there in my first session about the proofs of God, I talked a lot about those idea of ayat. Next, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَالسَّمَاءَ بَنَيْنَهَا بِأَيْدٍ وَإِنَّا لَمُوسِعُونَ, that and the heaven we constructed with strength, and indeed we are its expander. Now here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word musi'un, which is ism, it's a nominal form, it's not a verb. He didn't say we expanded it in the past tense. He said we are expanding it, if you were to translate it literally. The nominal form allows it to give the meaning that he's continuously expanding it. And it's again only in the past century that we've come to understand that the universe is expanding, right? It's expanding, and at one point it's gonna crunch. Again, just from that one word, not even from the one word, but the tense that the Quran uses. Had Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said we expanded it, it would have been past tense. And based on what we know of science right now, there would have maybe been, we would have to evaluate that and see maybe, there's a contradiction there. But no, it's so precise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the nominal form. And then also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the sun and the moon, that all are heavenly bodies in orbit and are swimming. So he describes the sun and the moon as being in a state of orbit. Now, in terms of the moon, that's obvious. In terms of the sun, it's obvious for us maybe now, but for a long time, people thought the sun was stationary, right? Or many people thought it. But we know scientifically that the sun actually has an orbit. It moves, it's not stationary, right? And in fact, the sun orbits the Milky Way, has its own orbit, and it orbits the Milky Way, and it takes about 226 million years to orbit around the center of the Milky Way. Again, very precise words that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses for the sun basically swimming, literally swimming. And this is actually connected maybe to kind of some of the literary miracle, but you guys know what a palindrome is? Palindrome is like when you take a word or a sentence, and if you were to flip it, it would say the same thing. What's the example in English? Kayak. You just flip it and say the same thing, right? So that's what a palindrome is. Now, interestingly, the end of the ayah, kullun fi falakin yasbahun. Kullun fi falak. This is a palindrome. If you take the kaf, lam, fa, ya, fa, lam, kaf, if you were to flip it, it would say that it would have the same. It would say the same thing. So literally, the letters are, if you look at it, like orbiting around the ya. That's how like the solar system works, right? It orbits around center. And then I give an example here, race car. Race car is another example of a palindrome. And the Quran has this type of thing in some other places too. And as I'm going to discuss when we get to the literary part, he has not palindromes, but it has something that's similar to a palindrome at the macro level. This is just one sentence. But as I'm going to show you guys, there's some really amazing patterns in the Quran when we discuss some surahs. Another interesting thing is in Surah Qiyamah. Surah Qiyamah is basically about the Day of Judgment and how human beings doubt that they'll be resurrected. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bala qadirina ala an nusawwiya banana. That we are able to proportion even his fingertips. Now, I find it amazing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referencing the fingertips. Because the fingertip, it was the 18th century, it was discovered that it seems to indicate that the fingertip is a really good tool to identify every human being. That a human being has unique fingertips. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so precise in his language that he says that we will resurrect you even up to your fingertips, each and every one of you. This one I found really interesting. This is in Surah Alaq again. The Quran refers to nasiyatin kadhibatin khatiyat, a lying, sinful forelock. Forelock, like this part of your head. And you really, if you translate it, it's like, unless you, again, go study the poetry and the balagha of the Quran, if you just look at the translation, it's like really confusing. Like, lying forelock? What does that mean? Like your forehead's lying? What's interesting is, it was discovered in the 1930s that the prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, is a part of the brain that's associated with different aspects of human thinking, amongst which is creating imaginative thoughts that could potentially be lying, right? The prefrontal cortex. And it has other aspects too, but this is one of the aspects to it. Again, very interesting. So that's some of the scientific miracles of the Quran, and there are multiple, and there are books on this. Again, Maurice Bucaille is probably the most famous. He wrote many years ago, many decades ago, but there are other books on this topic. Now I want to get into the literary miracle. One of the interesting things about the Quran is, when you look into the Quran, somebody who is not, and you can see this when non-Muslims, for their first time exposure to the Quran, especially if they're coming maybe from like a Christian, Jewish tradition, it just seems like the Quran's all over the place. It jumps from one topic to another. There doesn't seem any logic to it. If you look into the Bible, there's Genesis, and there's Revelations. Like the beginning, the end, that's it. Very linear. The Quran just seems to be jumping, and Orientalists, so Orientalists are people, non-Muslim Westerners who had studied Islam during the era of colonialism and even after colonialism. They also said this, it's like just chaos everywhere, right? There's no logic behind all this. But to give you an analogy, there is structure in the Quran, and scholars have understood the structure of the Quran, but it's like when you look into the sky and you look at the stars, for the person who's not trained in astronomy, he just sees random lights everywhere. There's no coherence to it. Somebody who studies astronomy sees, no, there's a Big Dipper, there's that constellation, there's that. They see there's patterns. And in fact, those patterns actually will guide them when they're traveling. That's similar with the Quran. You study it. Scholars who have dedicated their lives, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens up for them things that they see that the regular person might not. To give you an example, I was talking about palindrome, right? When you take a word and you flip it. The Quran has a thing called ring structure. Ring structure is kind of like a palindrome, sort of, but in terms of at the bigger level. So you have like a story, and then you have basically the beginning and the end will reflect the same theme. The second part of the story and the second to last part will reflect the same theme. Third part and the third class will reflect. You get it? So it's just reflecting in terms of its themes. Surah Baqarah is the biggest surah of the Quran, right? And if you look, the themes are really well patterned. The beginning of Surah Baqarah talks about faith and unbelief. The end of Surah Baqarah, faith and unbelief. The second portion of Surah Baqarah in terms of themes, Allah's creation and knowledge. The second to last portion of Surah Baqarah, Allah's creation and knowledge. Third part of Surah Baqarah in terms of theme, the deliverance of the Bani Israel, the law to the Bani Israel. The third to last part, the deliverance of the law to the Muslims. The fourth part, how Ibrahim was tested, the fourth to last on that end, how Muslims will be tested. And the middle is the Kaaba. Very, very interesting, right? And if you think about it, I mean, how can somebody have, like, if this is an oral tradition and somebody just making this up, how they could have created all these patterns? And this exists in other parts of the Quran as well. But Surah Baqarah, as you know, it's not a small surah, right? In a regular print of the Quran, it's about 50 pages. And interestingly, the middle Surah Baqarah says Ummatan Wasata, the middle nation. In the middle of Surah Baqarah is a reference to the middle. So this is one interesting thing. And there are people who do their PhDs just on this idea of composition of the Quran. Next, and this is just a nice reflection. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَا جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لِي رَجُلٍ مِّن قَلْبَيْنِ فِي جَوْفِهِ. Allah has not made for man two hearts in his interior. And that's what I mentioned about the precision of the Quran. The Quran is so precise. Why does the Quran mention man in this ayah? Why doesn't he just say insan? A woman can have two hearts in her. Her heart and then the heart of her baby when basically the baby's conceived. SubhanAllah. So the Quran is so precise. It's so precise. So these are just examples. And again, like I said, I'll give you guys tidbits, right? There are people who will dedicate their lives to one aspect of this and literally study it their whole lives. Like they'll do PhDs on it. Right? I'm just giving you guys snippets so you guys kind of understand the vast array of which the Quran is a miracle for us. Next, historical miracles. So when you talk about the history of two prominent figures in the Quran, Joseph al-Islam, and Musa, Moses. The Quran speaks about both of them in quite some detail, right? There's a whole surah dedicated to Yusuf, and then Musa is throughout the Quran. In the Quran, when Yusuf is engaged with the leader of that time, the leader is referred to as Malik, king. In the Bible, though, however, the leader is referred to as Pharaoh. Now, to understand, Pharaoh is not, when we talk about Pharaoh, we think about the person who basically Musa confronted, right? But Pharaoh is a title, it's not a name. It's like you have prime minister now, right? There's multiple prime ministers. So Pharaoh was a title of the ruler during a particular dynasty. And Musa was living at that time where the ruler was called Pharaoh. So in the Quran, the ruler at the time of Yusuf was referred to as Malik, as king. But in the Bible, the ruler is referred to as Pharaoh. Okay? And then, of course, at the time of Musa, the ruler is referred to as Pharaoh. Now, historians who have tried to kind of date the timeline of Yusuf and Musa, and again, this is work of historians, it's speculation, but they've dated Yusuf's timeline to 1674 to 1553, and Allah knows best, because this is, again, speculative work. And then Musa to 1391 to 2171 BCE. What's interesting is the title of Pharaoh was not used for rulers of Egypt, except in the New Kingdom period, which was the period when Musa was there, not at the time of Yusuf. And the Quran does not refer to the ruler of, at the time of Yusuf as Pharaoh, refers to him as king, but refers to the ruler at the time of Musa as Pharaoh. Whereas in the book of Genesis, it refers to both of them as Pharaoh, which seems to be a historical inaccuracy. And how precise that is, I mean, subhanAllah. But of course, this is contingent on the work of historians. Another interesting thing is the Quran mentions a story in Surah Ma'idah. So the Quran has stories about Isa and Maryam, alayhi salam, which are not found in the New Testament. They're not found. Amongst which is how Isa, he took clay birds and he blew in them and they became birds, like they became actual birds. It was a miracle. He took clay, he blew in it, and it became birds. And this is something that, of course, Christian polemicists want to attack. And the Quran would say that they just made this stuff up, right? This is just a bunch of things that Muslims made up. But if you study the history of, again, as I mentioned, the history of the Bible, first thing to understand is the New Testament is composed of 4 Gospels, right? So 4 kind of historical accounts of Jesus. But those 4 they're called the canonical Gospels, were chosen and canonized as the official Gospels only around the 4th century CE. Again, several centuries after Isa. And there were many books that never made it into the Bible. And up to this day, historians are discovering manuscripts. It was in, I believe, the early 20th century where you had the Nag Hammadi Library, where they found manuscripts of basically Gospels and these type of things that never made it in. Now, whether these are historically valid or not, that's another thing, right? But the point is that what exists in the New Testament, it wasn't all that there was, right? And amongst those, there was one of these Gospels that were found that never made it into the New Testament, which is the infamous Gospel of Thomas, in which the story of Jesus blowing in the clay and making them into birds is found. Very interesting how the Quran kind of corroborates non-canonical gospel traditions. Now, the thing is, somebody could be like, oh, maybe, and people accuse the Prophet, but maybe he took this from somewhere. But the thing is, when you look at the breadth of the Quran and how it validates, for example, non-canonical traditions, how it validates, as I mentioned, Egyptian history and other things, it's just amazing how it just deals with all these different historical events. And there was a very interesting person, for those who are interested in kind of comparative religion, in particular Christianity to Islam. His name is Gerald Dirks. Have you guys heard of him? Probably not, eh? So Gerald Dirks, he was a Christian priest. He did his Master's of Divinity in Harvard. So he was a very erudite scholar and priest. And actually, he wasn't interested in Islam in terms of, studying it as a religion, but he had a hobby that he was interested in horses, and Arabian horses are very good, right? So he was interested in Arabian horses, and through that he interacted with Muslims, etc. And then he eventually started studying Islam, and he ended up becoming Muslim. May Allah mercy him, he passed away a few years back, and he actually wrote a book called The Crossing Christ. He wrote many books, but this is one on which he kind of looks into the Bible, he looks into the Quran, and he explains the connections. It's a very good book, a very scholarly work on the topic. Okay, the next miracle we'll talk about is the onomastic miracle of the Quran. Anybody knows what onomastic means? No? Don't worry, I didn't know what it meant until I came across it. You could impress somebody next time and talk about the onomastic miracle of the Quran. Is the study of the history and origin of proper names. No, this is crazy. No, okay. There was people who studied the Quran just by the names and its etymology, and they spend years of their life doing this. I got this book. It's called The Onomastic Miracle of the Quran. It's like 700 pages. Now the thing is, like, I'm not sure like if everything he says is accurate, because obviously I'm not a onomastic scholar, and I don't know. I haven't studied like 50 different languages, right? But the fact of the matter is look how deep the Quran is, that there are people who could just study the proper names of the Quran and do that for years and be amazed by it. And I'm going to give you examples of this. So this book called Onomastic Miracle of the Quran, this scholar, I forget his name, he argues that within the verses of the Quran, you'll have a name that is not Arabic, because there are names in the Quran that have become Arabicized, but they're originally maybe Hebrew, Aramaic, or ancient Egyptian, etc. But in the Quran, there are hints at the meaning of those names. So I'll give you an example of this. In Surah Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says how Ibrahim, how he built the Kaaba with Ismail. And then they say, رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. O Lord, accept this from us. You are the all-hearing, the all-knowing. The all-hearing, all-knowing. If you look into the word Ismail and you go back to the Hebrew, Ishmael means God hears. And here is referring to Allah's as-Sami, Allah's all-hearing. It's very interesting. Another example, Ishaq. The Quran gives an example when Sarah is giving the glad tidings of Ishaq. Sarah was very old, right? And she couldn't conceive that she would have a child. It was unconceivable. And then the angel said that you're going to have a child. And she was so amazed. فضحكت, she laughed. She laughed. فبشرناها بإسحاق. She laughed at the fact that they gave her glad tidings of Ishaq. Again, if you go to Ishaq, you go to the Hebrew, Ishaq, the laughing one. You guys see the thing here? And again, like I'm not an expert in Hebrew at all, right? So, but it is really fascinating. And the Quran is full of this type of stuff, eh? So I'm just giving you examples of Hebrew. The author goes into ancient Egyptian and other languages as well. Okay, so that's one. SubhanAllah, I think I'm almost done. Next is experiential proof. So this is what you would call subjective proof. It's not maybe something that will be convincing or you could convince somebody else of your own experience. But for the person who experiences it, it's a very powerful thing. And I give this analogy like, yani, if I have like a Japanese mango in front of you, you guys know what Japanese mango is? It's like the most expensive mango in the world. It's $100 for one mango, right? I never had one, by the way. I can't afford it. But if I had a Japanese mango and I'm describing it to you, right? So nice and juicy, and I give you a paper with all its composition. I'm telling you everything about it. And they say, how does it taste? I'm like, I don't know. Did you taste it? You didn't taste it. I'm telling you about it. And then I come in and I eat it in front of you. Isn't it amazing? There's a difference between tasting something and then just having information about it. And in epistemology, in the realm of human knowledge, that's a form of knowing, experiencing things. And that's actually one of the limits of science, is it can't get into certain subjective experiences of human beings. It just can't, right? Like when you drink a nice, cup of coffee, science can come and maybe describe what's happening in your brain, but it can't quantify your experience. So there are countless people throughout the world who have been moved by the Quran in a way that is just amazing, right? Even non-Muslims, you could go on YouTube and find non-Muslims who, they listen to the Quran, they don't even know what it means and they get moved by it, right? And there's also millions of Muslims who don't know its meaning and they listen to it and they just get moved by it. I always give this example, I've given it many times. When I was studying in school, and I had a colleague who was studying with me, a friend, and he was from Colombia, and we were on the bus, and when we were on the bus, I would put on the Quran with my headphones, and then one time he's like, "What's this? What music are you listening to?" I said, "I'm not listening to music. I'm listening to Quran." So then he's like, "Let me listen." And then so I put it on, and then he's like, and he gave it back to me. So I'm like, okay, he's not impressed, whatever. It doesn't make a difference to me. A few weeks later, or it was a few months later, his wife was pregnant and she was having a lot of anxiety. When you're pregnant, you go through a lot of difficulty. And he said, that religious music you were listening to. I'm like, bro, it's not music. He's like, send it to me because my wife has anxiety and I want her to listen. And she used to listen to the Quran to calm herself. It's just amazing. And I mean, I've lost touch with them, so I don't know. But there are many people who become Muslim just by listening to the Quran, right? And the Quran itself mentions that it gives tranquility to the hearts. It gives tranquility to the hearts. So this is kind of the experiential knowledge, which again, maybe not be the most powerful thing when you're kind of explaining to others, but it's powerful for the person who experiences it, undoubtedly. And then the people, like just getting somebody to listen to the Quran, and if they have some goodness inside of them, they will be moved by it. They will be moved by it. So that's related to the experiential proof. And if you guys remember, I guess I mean only two of you were here for the other sessions. I mentioned that there's even this idea of experiential knowledge in terms of belief in God as well. right? That this is something embedded in the human being. Even if they can't come up with rational arguments, it's so embedded within inside them. And it's such a powerful experience that they just know they believe in God, right? And the whole big contingent of humanity is just, they feel that, right? They can't tell you scientific arguments. They just know God is there. So this is basically the different aspects that I mentioned. So I mentioned, what did I mention? The literary, the preservation, scientific, what else did I mention? Historical and experiential. I think those are 5, right? And if anybody wants to read up further on this topic, there's one book called The Eternal Challenge, A Journey Through the Miraculous Quran. It's a free book you could get. It's published by IERA. They're like an organization that specializes in dawah. And they do a lot of cool stuff. They go like travel to like in the Amazon jungle and give dawah there in Mongolia. And they do a lot of cool work. The Crossing Crescent, which I already referred to by Gerald Dirks. And Scientific Science in the Quran. It's just an Intro to Islam book that's some group in UK recently published. There's tons of these type of books. This one, I like it a lot, but it's more recent. But there's tons of them. So this is just for further reading. And again, there's a lot you can read, right? Because I took from multiple sources, but this is kind of like to get your fingers wet on these topics if you're interested in them. So inshallah, with that, I'll conclude. And just a quick thing, as you guys know, that I'm the chaplain here at McGill. I'm representing Mount Lumiere. So if any of you guys have any questions, concerns, or anything, whether related to this or to anything related to Islam, you could feel free to contact me. You could send me an email, or you could even book a session, a counseling session, which I could do online or in person as well. Jazakallah khair, everybody. I'll open up for questions or comments.